So, Dr. Suru, in your opinion, why is politics, policy, and tech a trilemma today? Like, why is it difficult to balance all of these three? Let's start with a country like India, but I would imagine it's similar for other places as well.
Well, I mean, in India, we are seeing in many ways a very sharp outline of some of the challenges of this trilemma. That is, that tech has made significant inroads into the ways in which people function in society and in politics. The manner in which that has changed both society and politics is one aspect of the problem, but the responses individual citizens on the one hand and the government on the other to the way in which tech has become dominant have again shaped a new set of dilemmas. For example, in India, we now have the government introducing the information technology intermediary guidelines and digital media ethics code rules. And these are rules which are intended very much to curb some of the what the government sees as the excesses of the tech industry. And they've been pushed back against that both by, for example, internet freedom organizations that are essentially working on the side of civil society as they see it, speaking in terms of freedom of speech and expression and so on. And on the other hand, pushback from the IT companies themselves, saying that they have certain global yardsticks they want to maintain and that what's being demanded of them is not in consonance, they argue, even with India's constitutional freedoms. So there's your trilemma very starkly illustrated. You know, if Twitter can shut down President Trump in America and Kangana Ranaut in India, who else can it shut down? Should it be allowed to shut down? What are the yardsticks on the basis of which it exercises its independent judgment? Or if it's operating in India, should it essentially obediently follow the Indian law? That is, if somebody it wants to shut down in India is deemed by the government of India not to have committed any legally cognizable offense, then would Twitter have to undo their shutdown on a government order? These are all questions to which answers are yet to be found, but they're amongst the kinds of questions that are coming up. On the one hand, you have a company like Twitter saying we have objective standards which we uphold globally, and we don't want to encourage hate speech or incitement or whatever, and that's why Mr. Trump and Ms. Ranaut are gone. Whereas there are fairly sort of self-righteously outraged people in India saying, you know, we've had the East India Company telling us what to do, and I'm now not going to let Twitter Inc., a California-based company, tell us what to do. We will decide India's laws that will prevail if you want to do business in India. And there are valid arguments, if you like, on both sides of this particular debate. And then at the same time, the government. Is the government an entirely neutral player, free of any political preconceptions of its own? Obviously not. Yes, there are bureaucrats who are supposed to be politically colorless, but the government ultimately has a political preference of its own, and indefinitely it is expected to take a political stand as well. So who safeguards the interests of the ordinary citizen? In some ways, the trilemma that you've outlined gets even more complicated the more you start parsing the various questions involved.
Absolutely, Dr. Tharoor. One question that I often think about is, when it comes to tech platforms, there are very few engineers building them out, but they affect all of us. And is there a way we can, come up with a more democratic way in which tech can be regulated? Do you see that as a possibility? Because I think that the understanding of how algorithms work is fairly restricted right now, but it impacts everybody. So should everybody have an opinion? Should everybody weigh in? Or should there be another kind of mechanism? Do you have any thoughts on that particular subject?
Yeah, well, look, frankly, I'm a member of Parliament. I chair the Parliamentary Committee on IT, and my committee is discussing these issues. Of course, we've had another hiatus because of COVID. We lost several months last year to COVID lockdowns, and we've had a difficulty in meetings since March, since we're not allowed virtual meetings. Under our rules, we have to meet physically, and because of the COVID situation, physical meetings have not been possible. In fact, the one meeting I tried to call had to be cancelled for lack of a quorum, and I've now convened a meeting on this very issue on the 18th of June. But it's anybody's guess whether I'll be able to get a quorum to travel to Delhi and arrive to discuss it. So we're looking at a situation where the Parliamentary Committee is the democratic mechanism that permits very detailed discussion with the ministry as well as with the companies. So we would, for example, and we have been, as this issue has evolved, we would hear from Twitter, from Facebook, from WhatsApp, as well as from the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. And where necessary, we can also hear from other ministries, including state governments. So that's the democratic input. You're right to say every individual citizen of our country is affected shouldn't their views be heard. As a practical proposition, we expect the MPs to articulate the views of the ordinary citizens whom they represent. So people with opinions and views on this would normally come up through their MPs and be heard. We do also occasionally summon individual citizens to testify. We've done so on a number of occasions. But the difficulty is that every selection one makes is invidious. So we've tended to go for people who have written to us and requested a hearing, and where we felt there was a basis for their request to be heard. For example, citizens who claim to have been victims of a surveillance snoop on their WhatsApp, or somebody who's filed a case in the Supreme Court on aspects of this. People like that, when they've written to us, we've given them a hearing in the committee. Otherwise, by and large, public opinion is supposed to be voiced by people's representatives, and namely the MPs. Then, when you talk about policy making, laws and regulations are essentially written by the government, which in practice means a bureaucracy. It's usually on matters involving policy questions approved either by the minister or by the entire minister, that is, by the cabinet. But when issues become very complicated technically, as IT tends to be seen as being, I don't know to what extent there's a widespread political awareness across the government on what's involved. So I suspect it's really done by the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, or MIGHTY, as we slightly jokingly call it, the MIGHTY Ministry. And MIGHTY, in turn, would probably speak to its own minister, and that may be it. In the case of the IT intermediary guidelines, of course, we also have the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting involved, because part of these regulations deal with the regulation of digital news media, even though there is a lack of clarity on exactly which news media these rules would apply to. OTT platforms like Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney, Hotstar, etc. All of these are very popular in India, but they would now, as we understand it, come under the ambit of these rules, and they're still figuring out ways to cope and comply. So there's a lot of these things going on. At the end of the day, regulations don't need to be voted by Parliament. Laws do. And that too is another question. I mean, some are arguing that this really ought to be subject to a full parliamentary debate. At any rate, the committee is going to consider it very fully and make recommendations which the ministry and the parliament are free to take up or disregard.
Understood.
Dr. Tharoor, I'd love to jump in with
Sure, Vedika.
maybe a slightly broader question, and maybe a slightly more personal one. You were one of the first adopters of Twitter in India. As a politician, you have been extremely tech savvy, and you've also been obviously you're one of the most articulate and famous observers of India and in India's development, India's story. One question I had for you was, as you take the larger lens, how do you look at what the new normal post-COVID is going to be, and how do you think about tech kind of as a motive, so to speak, of India's developments, it's advancement. We've had this notion, especially that was very, very popular in the 2000s, India going, from the elephant to the tiger to the cell phone. Where do we go next?
Right. Well, I mean, there's no question. I think everywhere in the world, and India is no exception, that the post-COVID world is going to be far more reliant on tech than the pre-COVID world, because what happened was we suddenly had a deep acceleration of resort to technology, where people who'd never been on a video conference in their lives were suddenly having to hold all their meetings on Zoom and its various competitors, where students who may not necessarily have been allowed to watch TV at home were suddenly doing classes online, etc. So, I mean, there's no question that we've all become much more reliant on tech. Work from home has become such a significant change in the way in which normal professional practices are being conducted, that all of this is going to really raise very serious implications in every sector of society. If you look at politics, there's no question that tech has contributed to the rise of the surveillance state. When we first, for example, came up to face the inadequacies of existing data systems to monitor and track the spread of the transmission of the COVID virus, immediately a whole bunch of people around the world developed dedicated apps and tools to track people's data, their travel history, their contact with other individuals who may or may not be infected. And at that point, everyone was only focused on COVID. No one realized, my God, what wonderful tools you've created for authoritarian governments to surveil all your contacts and increase their data gathering. We've seen, for example, the rise of AI and the open collaboration between governments and big tech. We also know there's concentration of AI power and data in the hands of very few governments and very few organizations. Where is this going to go? I think that it's not at all clear how it's going to go. Tech, when it comes to issues like education, I think the jury is still out. Everything that I'm hearing, and unfortunately my kids are past the educational stage and my grandson is too young to be severely affected, but the fact is that most of what I pick up from young parents and people right up to college and university is that this hasn't been great, that people have found it severely limiting to have to learn only through virtual means, and online education, many people say, has been actually rather disappointing, underwhelming, if you like. I remember before COVID, there was so much talk about EdTech and venture capitalists. We're on a site called Network Capital. So venture capitalists were investing billions already in 2019, for example, in education technology companies. They must have thought they'd absolutely done the right thing when suddenly education, more and more education moved online. But today, the feedback they're getting is actually rather negative, and that very many students, I think, are saying that they don't want this. They want a campus experience. They want to interact with teachers face to face. They want to meet friends and make friends and enjoy an educational life that is not all about staring at a screen. And then, of course, the digital divide in a country like India, where we've seen some of the horrors of tech-based education. I'll never forget, because it's seared into my heart practically, the terrible story of a young Dalit girl who was her class topper till class 10 in Kerala. And she was not just Dalit, she was the daughter of a daily wage worker. Now, when COVID came, of course, daily wage workers lost their jobs. There was no work to be done. Everyone was locked down. The family had literally no income. They were eating in community kitchens to survive. There was no question of her being able to go online. When an outcry went up, Kerala being a fairly left-centered state, the government said, okay, whatever is being offered online, we'll also put on a government television channel that everyone can watch. But it so happened that that poor girl, her family's sole TV was broken down. Her father had no money to repair it. And this bright, talented class topper, seeing all her classmates racing ahead of her, committed suicide. And it's just a horrific story. One of the things I'm doing this very week, in fact, as classes are resuming in Kerala, is conducting a donation drive, which I'm matching, to buy smartphones for kids in schools to be able to follow their classes online. But there'll be many of these kids whose parents will not be able to afford the data pack. And ultimately, how much can you keep on giving them? We're going to do what we can. I'm only doing it in my constituency. I'm sure others can do it elsewhere. But we can't afford to think about tech as if everyone has ubiquitous access to it, as everybody listening to Clubhouse does, because there are an awful lot of people who don't have it. So the prospect of virtual classrooms becoming commonplace is not something we need to greet with complete enthusiasm, in my view. And so it goes. I've only scratched the surface of the larger question. Will tech, when you think about it, affect other sectors? Very obviously, yes. The military is already going heavily tech. You may end up in future wars where no human beings are actually involved in killing each other, but computer-directed drone technology will be destroying cities and people without soldiers having to actually spill blood. That could happen. Economic transformations with the countries that have more dominant technological products, particularly with AI taking over, entirely possible. Would there be manufacturing and services in other sectors recovering from the COVID-induced setbacks and lockdowns? Who knows? Workplace management. There's a massive increase in the adoption of remote working. And I read an article recently about how office buildings in New York are now basically going empty because companies are pulling out those that were renting. They canceled their rents. They don't want to have this. But what does that do in terms of people's happiness quotient at work, stress levels? How does it help when people are coping with tensions at home as well as tensions at the office and their daily work? Would some sort of permanent adoption of hybrid work schedules start happening? Some people will certainly say that a more flexible working schedule has made them more happy, more at peace, easier to juggle their family responsibilities, etc. Others are saying, of course, that they've actually become worse at both work and family because of the conflation of the two. So, you're asking me a question about something which is still very much shaking itself out. It's like really trying to paint a picture of a moving train or a moving plane or a moving drone, if you like, in today's terms. And so all I can offer are these preliminary observations while saying that I believe a lot of these questions will be playing themselves out in the next few years.
Right.
I agree with you, but one follow up I had there was my sense from your responses was that you are slightly pessimistic about the impact that technology will have on our lives. And I wanted to challenge that a bit because we've also seen a lot, especially in India, and I completely agree with you about the inequity in access to technology, but we've also seen a lot of the good that technology can do. Your own government had, previously championed the use of Aadhaar. We've seen the way in which that, for all the faults, it has made access to public services, distribution of public services much easier. And as you look at what the government needs to do post COVID, given that we are moving or going to move to a much more digital or digitally enabled world, how do you think about the ways in which the government or your own political party needs to engage with tech companies, not just international tech companies, but domestic technology companies, and with the issues of giving access to tech infrastructure
Right.
to the citizens of India?
Sure. Vedika, look, I'm engaging all the time, so I certainly would encourage all political parties to engage with tech companies, but I'm not prescribing, shall we say, their own innovation, their own developments and so on to them because that's their domain and not mine. What I'm concerned about is precisely public policy questions like access. I want to ensure that my constituents, including the poorest ones, don't feel left out, that we don't get lopsided patterns of development because some people are more equal than others in a tech-driven world, which unfortunately is still the case for the most part. I do want to see also that those who, for various reasons, I mean, I used to be. Let me open a parenthesis here and say, to something like when it comes to something like women students from traditional conservative families, for example, Muslim families, tribal families, and so on, being able to access education without having to physically go to a classroom. So connect them online and make it possible for them to earn a degree or a high school graduation or a college graduation. That was a big thing that I pushed very strongly when I was in the Ministry of Education. And I push very strongly for much more of this kind of open schooling and all of that stuff. So don't get me wrong, I'm not a Luddite, I'm not entirely skeptical, but I'm very conscious that while technology can help enhance opportunities for people like that, it can also put enormous strains on those whose access to those opportunities are less than others. I mean, a classic example is people who've got a fiber optic sort of broadband connection at home and their ease of access to video versus the situation facing people who may be struggling with a very modestly paid mobile telephone data pack on their smartphone because that's all their family can afford. I mean, even something as simple as that. How do you level the playing field? You can't. And the question is, can we demand of tech companies that they gear their products not just to the elite, which can afford to pay for them and also use them, but also to the ordinary citizen? So I'm very much looking at all of this in that spirit, but I'm not fundamentally skeptical. All I'm saying is that a certain amount of technological determinism has captured people's imaginations. They see this irresistible juggernaut of technology moving forward and all of us leaping enthusiastically onto the bandwagon. All I'm saying is, yes, but still hold your horses because we will have people not getting to that bandwagon, not being able to climb on, not being able to stay on it, and we have to ensure in making public policy that we ensure that everyone has as much as possible a fair and even shake. At the same time, as a policymaker, for example, I would love to encourage more policies that give India an opportunity to compete with the best of the world at the cutting edge of some of the stuff. Why shouldn't India be doing? I mean, it's astonishing to see the number of Indian researchers in Silicon Valley who are bigwigs and players in AI. Why can't some of those Indian brains in India be doing similar cutting edge work in AI in India? I don't know what the impediments are, but I would be very much in favor of encouraging that to happen. So I'm not saying reduce everything to the lowest common denominator. I'm saying take everything into account.
Got it. Thanks, Dr. Tharoor. First of all, we have a network capital as a large 100,000 plus global community. We would like to support your fundraiser. So I'm going to take the link of that from your staff and share it among our community. But you said something really interesting about education in TED Talks, the four E's of education, where you talked about excellence, equity, and so forth. And I really think there's need to reimagine the way we look at education in the post-pandemic world. Vedika had a really interesting tweet recently where she said that Indian EdTech industry is basically becoming a test prep industry. And I think to a
Yeah.
large that's true. So, Dr. Tharoor, how might we use the four E's to reimagine education in the post-COVID world? How might you think about it?
Look, again, the answer in India may not be the same as an answer in England or America or Canada, whatever. So let me just focus on India because that's where I work and those are the policies I'm concerned about. I would like to enhance access to technology in education, but I'm very conscious that the vast majority of India's students are functioning in schools which cannot even take 24/7 electricity for granted, let alone anything else. I mean, I remember when we tried to encourage educational video conferencing in my time in the ministry, we got many complaints from state governments that they were not able to take advantage of it because they didn't have enough reliable supplies of electricity. So we said, okay, we'll give you money to buy generators so that you can generate electricity and log into these video conference classes coming to you from Delhi or whatever. And of course, we did get them the generators, did give them the money, but they used their generators when VIPs came to visit their schools and didn't have enough to function when video conference classes needed to be taken. It's at that kind of level. The last mile connectivity in broadband is still pretty pathetic in large areas of our country, particularly when you get to rural schools and so on. Then there is the question also of interpretation of these lessons. Imagine you have a world-class, or at least the best of its kind in India class educational lecture coming to technologically through either video conferencing from Delhi, or you have it from, for example, people coming out of a sophisticated course or anything like that. And then what happens is that essentially people are imbibing the same lecture, whether they're in a big city and have had a sophisticated English medium education, or whether they're in a small rural area and are struggling with English as a second or even a third language. Very often in these situations, you need teachers as a buffer who can interpret what those lectures are saying and explain them to the students. But are our teachers available in sufficient number and quality to be able to do that? Far from certain that's true, or that's true everywhere. So, forgive me for saying that EdTech is important, and it should not be, as Vedica rightly warns, just be reduced to test prep tech. But at the same time, it cannot be an all-in-all answer, because it will just keep leaving too many people behind. And I do need to worry about all of this. In fact, even for something as simple as what's going on right now with many, many crucial examinations, if you offer offline examinations, that is, people going to exam halls, you expose the students to the risk of COVID. You offer them online, and you again immediately disadvantage those who are living in poorer areas with poor electricity, poor broadband connectivity, who have to take the same exam in the same time frame with those who have much faster broadband speeds and more assured electricity. So, you're facing some real dilemmas at the moment in the Indian context, which will require enlightened public policy that, frankly, I don't think has yet been made.
Yes. In your first masterclass on network capital, you talked about the power of wonder and curiosity in learning. And I think if there's one thing that India should really do, is to make sure that the school curriculum, and even when people go to college, this sense of wonder doesn't get lost. Most of jobs of tomorrow don't exist today. So I think test prep is one small aspect of the equation. There's need to do a lot more.
That's right. And I'm in a country which is now living with the highest levels of unemployment ever recorded. Ever since they started keeping figures on unemployment in India, that's the level of unemployment we have now. And you're looking at a situation where you have to ask yourself, well, does tech have an impact on employment? It's fascinating to see that what I'm getting from Western sources as to what's happening with layoffs, COVID-induced layoffs, if you can call them that, in many Western economies, is that, for example, marketing, sales, and operations staff are being let go in a number of companies. But software developers, testers, people with experience in AI or data science or machine learning, they're the ones who've got job security. They're the areas in which jobs are available. So even in the Western world, you'll find that tech has already got winners and losers. And you're certainly going to see a lot more of this affecting a lot more people in countries like mine. Look, I'm in a situation where Kerala, the states in which I function mainly, is much more advanced than many other parts of India. And so we were getting to a stage where pretty much every student, even in government schools, was being made computer literate. And we were telling them that this is now basic. You better know how to use a computer, just as your parents knew how to use a pen and paper, and your grandparents knew how to use a slate and chalk. That's one of my sort of standard lines in explaining all of this to dubious parents who've never seen a computer in their lives. But is that going to be enough? I mean, just that level of basic computer literacy may not be enough at all to get ahead in the galloping new world of technology that we're facing up to. So there's all these astonishing changes. And the other thing one should remember is the way in which so much is getting obsolete so quickly. I remember when I came into Indian politics just a few years ago, a dozen years ago, um, uh, all of this is happening. I'd just written the book that Vedica alluded to, The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone, talking about the transformation of India's economy. I was talking about tech and how, for example, the cell phone epitomized the way in which things had so dramatically changed since the India that I had left to go to graduate school in the US from in 1975. And what a dramatic transformation, all the exciting potential. But at that time, when I'd come back to India, India was riding the crest of a boom in something that was being hailed as a sunrise industry of the new technology, and that's an industry called medical transcriptions. What was that? Well, an American doctor would see his patients all day, dictate his notes into the computer. At the end of the day, would be zinged over to India while he went to sleep. An Indian with some basic medical experience, education, would wake up, type up all his notes, transcribe them, in other words, zing them back to America. The doctor would come in the next morning, refreshed from his sleep, and have all his case notes typed up for him, ready to use. And it was much cheaper than having a secretary hired on American wages to take dictation and do this. Obviously, many fewer man hours involved at much lower dollar rates. And it became a great idea, and medical transcription took off. And by about 2005, I think India had something like 85 to 90% of the global medical transcription market. Companies were being established that did nothing but this. Students were being dragooned into becoming professional medical transcribers. It was considered a huge boom industry. It's gone kaput completely. Why? Because no one in that business anticipated the development of voice recognition software through AI that would make it totally unnecessary for that doctor to have to pay a transcriber in India to transcribe his notes. He would buy software one time and dictate his notes into his computer and see the text coming up in real time before his very eyes. End of the story. Medical transcription went bust. 95% of the companies in that business have either had to take on other businesses or just fold, massive losses and unemployment resulting. Now, there's a classic example of how tech has just completely changed within a span of a decade. What was considered a sunrise industry, how quickly it became a sunset industry. There's a study by the Oxford Martin School a few years ago that said that 30% of the jobs in the world in 2030 will be jobs that don't exist today. Right? So how do you prepare people for a job that doesn't exist? You just get them to somehow train them to think outside the box. But that's not what India is good at. As Vedica says, we're all about exam prep. Exam prep is based on last year's questions and the questions of the year before. They cannot anticipate entire subjects that don't exist today. So it's a fascinating, challenging world. It's going to require a lot of very nimble policy making and very imaginative, out-of-the-box thinking. And I have real worries and doubts as to whether our political class and our bureaucratic class are up to the challenge of doing that kind of thinking and preparing our Indian students to take advantage of those opportunities when this change is upon us.
Yeah.
Dr. Tharoor, just to follow up on that point.
2030 jobs.
Yeah, go ahead, Vedika.
Sorry, Utkarsh, I might have interrupted you. But Dr. Tharoor, just to follow up on that point, when you talk about imaginative policy changes and politicians and bureaucrats not being up to the challenge in India.
Well, there are honorable exceptions, and I think you're related to one of them. So there are people who think big, but there is an awful lot of people who don't.
No, I completely agree with you. But I wanted to, especially for people in the audience who might not be as familiar with policy making and the bureaucracy and the nuances of that, I wanted you to elaborate a bit more on that. What do you mean by the lack of imagination, and what are some of the challenges that you see both as a member of parliament and as an ex-minister that make you say that we perhaps don't have that talent or that state capacity for coming up with innovative policy?
No, we are constantly playing catch up, I'm afraid. And I'm not, this is not a political statement. I'm not just blaming the current government. I think all Indian governments are perhaps equally culpable in this regard. One of the interesting things is the way in which we latched onto engineering education, for example, as something that was going to be the answer to many of the demands of our young people. And we started producing the world's second largest number of engineering graduates. We graduate about, if I have the number correct, about 500,000 engineering graduates a year. And studies have established, and studies conducted in the real world by business organizations and others have established that 65, 66% of engineering graduates end up in jobs that don't require an engineering degree, because either what they've studied is totally unrelated to the real world, or what they've studied has been overtaken in the real world, but they're still anchored in old syllabi and old methods of teaching, and are functioning in institutions which are never kept up with the dramatic changes that are taking place in the real world in which their education needs to be applied. Now, can we have policy making that changes that around? Of course you can. I can give you a very trivial example. When I was minister, we had decided that we would no longer grant permission for anyone to open a polytechnic anywhere in India unless they had a tie-up with a real-world industry within 30 kilometers of the place they were establishing their polytechnic. We said there's absolutely no point educating children something that's a vocational subject like a vocational institution like a polytechnic, out of decades-old textbooks being taught by people who haven't been inside a real workplace for ages. We really need to connect them to the real world. But that kind of policy change took a long time coming. And inevitably there was resistance from those who had, for example, land and wanted to establish a polytechnic as a commercial proposition, but didn't have an industry they could connect to, and so on and so forth. That's one kind of example. Another would relate to the entire culture of examinations. We are still a very heavily exam-oriented culture, and if anything, we have actually become even more immersed in that. When I was at university, now 4.5 decades ago, colleges were much freer to take people for a mixture of things. Their extracurricular talents, their sporting abilities, their speaking abilities, their theatrical abilities, all counted, not just their marks. But inevitably, perhaps partially because of the pressure of the number of applicants and so on, all of this has been eliminated, and now it comes down to your percentage in your school leaving examinations. That's it. Courts have ruled that if somebody has, let's say, 95% in a particular subject, and that's not deemed enough to be interviewed for admission in a particular college, then nobody with below 95 may be summoned for an interview unless everybody above that person is also interviewed. And as a result, you eliminate a lot of people who may have only 94.5, but who are brilliant debaters or whatever, or would be great assets for the student magazine or whatever. Out. Doesn't make any difference. And that's the kind of thing that India has been reduced to. We do not have enough room for flexibility in any sort of actual practice in the education system. And with an examination culture, we often have no room for out-of-the-box thinking. It's something that, going right back to the school system, where we tend, unfortunately, to require our students to be totally obedient to and respectful of our teachers, and essentially repeat what the teacher tells them to do. And then as they grow older, they have to learn from their textbooks and from their teachers' lectures and regurgitate the same old stuff, and often in the same old words into the examination paper. That style of education has gone from those societies that are keeping up with what's going on in the world. If you look at even the transformations in China's educational system in the last 10 years and contrast that with how little transformation there has been in the Indian educational system in the last 10 years, you know where we are lagging and slipping behind. That's the kind of thing I was alluding to, Vedika.
No, that's very helpful. The other question that I had, kind of just following up on that point, is how do you alluded to this earlier, the ways in which technology, especially during COVID, has changed the way all of us live our lives and do our work. What has that meant for politicians, bureaucrats, and parliament. And the reason I ask that is because I almost wonder if this mindset that you allude to also comes from this very old-fashioned way of working. And I was
Totally.
curious about your thoughts.
Totally. Well, actually, it hasn't gone far enough in the world of politics and parliament, which is your question, because I am the one of the more frustrated objectors to what's going on. Parliament has only been able to meet physically, which means it's had very, very, very little meeting time since COVID began, because there has been total resistance from the powers that be to anything hybrid, where some members could log in from home and others could be physically there or anything, or even to have a parliament connected virtually. We're supposed to be an IT powerhouse, but we apparently are unable to connect, 500 parliamentarians into one system. It gets worse when you look at the parliamentary committees, which is where a lot of the detailed nitty-gritty of parliamentary work is done. The parliamentary committees have, in theory, 31 members. In practice, you get between 15 and 20 for a good meeting, and never do you get all 31 showing up at a meeting. So your quorum, on the other hand, is one-third of the membership, so that's 11 members. Now, imagine if you have various states with various different lockdown restrictions. Some states would allow you to travel, but when you come back, you've got to go into quarantine, so you won't travel. Some states won't let you come in without going through quarantine at the receiving state, and so on. So what happens at the end of the day is that MPs say we'd much rather just log into a parliamentary committee meeting virtually. Again, the technology is available, it exists. The rules don't permit it. So other parliamentary committee chairmen and I have been appealing repeatedly to the Lok Sabha Speaker and the chairman of the Rajya Sabha, who's the Vice President of India, but they will not budge. They say, no, the rules do not permit anything but physical meetings. So when we have this kind of approach in India, where Parliament is not able to do its work of pursuing democratic accountability in a system like ours, because you are not able to meet physically, or you can't assemble a quorum to meet physically because people are not able to come during COVID time and with COVID restrictions. What you do, you basically throw your head in your hands and say, my gosh, how can this be happening in the third decade of the 21st century? So my frustrations are typical of the larger question you asked. Can technology help with politics and politicians and parliamentarians? Of course it can. I would love a situation where you could meet your parliamentary committee from home, where you could meet as a parliament, irrespective of what's going on in terms of COVID lockdowns or any other kind of lockdowns, where you could actually even perhaps conduct election campaigns and voting technologically. Though I know there's a lot of mistrust of technology in that last example, and probably I would be in a very small minority of MPs who's willing to risk my own future with people voting with the push of a button at home or in designated centers. But anyway, I'm quite willing to see technology applied to all those areas. But there's tremendous resistance in the system. And none of these things that I've just mentioned have actually happened.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. We can't end this particular dialogue without discussing China and the global world order. So, want to ask, are you seeing the emergence of more cooperation among nations? And if we look at China and its emerging influence on India and the rest of the world, are there some broader lessons that India should consider as we prepare for, a post-pandemic new normal world?
Well, China has certainly mastered the pandemic, and the economic distance between China and everyone else has increased dramatically thanks to COVID. There's no question about that. In relative terms, just look at all the numbers from 2019-20 and look at all the numbers for today, and China has just put distance between itself and everyone else. When other economies declined last year, China has galloped forward. China has widened its lead over a contender like India by far. And of course, it has also a diplomatic marriage of convenience with Russia, in which China is the senior partner now, not like in the past. And its Belt and Road Initiative has managed to win not just partners and so on, but at least win the silence of others who feel they can't afford to be completely on the wrong side of China. So you're looking at a China that has transformed itself quite dramatically. As far as international cooperation that you asked about is concerned, we dodged a bullet when America voted Trump out, because Trump, as you know, had withdrawn from the World Health Organization, withdrawn from UNESCO, was denouncing China from every pulpit, and was talking about really potentially triggering a breakup of international institutions and organizations. Now that President Biden has undone all of that, and the U.S. is talking to its rivals and critics, we perhaps can still hope for some international cooperation. But there are profound misgivings, and now the increasing conviction of people that the COVID virus itself emerged from a lab in Wuhan rather than from a bat or a pangolin or whatever else, suggests that the divisions between China and the rest of the world will not just be economic. There'll be levels of mistrust and doubt and challenge which will have geopolitical implications as well. So it's a very big question that requires a much longer answer than we have time for, but I would say that China is now the most significant factor in every major country's foreign policy calculations over the next few years. And India, obviously, as a next door neighbor of China, is not at all exempt from that. So that's a very, very important issue for us. I mean, at the same time, I'm not talking in terms of China as a military threat so much, though we've had a taste of that in Galwan just exactly a year ago today or tomorrow. But also, let me say that the interesting thing is that, for example, COVID-19 killed more Americans than died in all the wars that have taken place since 1945, including the Vietnam and Korean Wars. So, from America's point of view, you could argue that the military threats facing Americans pale by comparison with the threat posed by a pandemic like COVID. So I see international cooperation multiplying, something like the effort that Mr. Biden has actively supported to promote access to vaccines for poor countries, help strengthen the capacity of their healthcare systems. If that can really happen, if you can really have international cooperation on the public health front, you will actually, and do it, by the way, not just out of altruism, but because if the COVID virus is running free in Africa or Asia, it will eventually come to America and the UK and Europe and so on. So there's no question that it is in everyone's interest to see the world as one unit when it comes to dealing with public health. That could be the crucible of a level of international cooperation that might just augur well for international geopolitics also. But I'm not urging anyone to hold their breath for that to happen. It's going to be an uphill struggle, and the divisions in global geopolitics, to my mind, are still far more stark and starkly apparent than the levels of cooperation.
Well, thank you, Dr. Tharoor. And maybe like towards the end, if you find time, you can mention some lessons that India can draw. But I think it's time for audience questions. So shall we pull up, I've seen many raised hands and folks who want to ask questions. Let's have them up on stage.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Tharoor. I really enjoyed this discussion, and I can't agree more about the need for foresight and understanding China. I have a question about the IT rules and the way forward for them, because given that the structure of the IT rules currently, it would mean that there would be increased government regulation, and this would also be something that most users and platforms will not be comfortable with. So, what do you think would be the way forward?
I'm sorry on this one. I've got to be a little careful because as chairman of a committee that's still considering this issue, I can't really take a policy stand without some of my ruling party members demanding my head and demanding my removal because I've discussed matters that the committee is yet to take a position on. So I was very careful in answering Utkarsh's initial question to just confine myself to generalities and the broad path forward. The committee still has to discuss specifics and to come up with particular policy responses, which we will then have to adopt in a report. Once that's out, then each of us is individually much freer to speak and speak for ourselves. I'd broadly say that there are large questions involved here, which many of us will want to consider. There are questions that relate to the obligations on companies, on the question of redressal grievances from ordinary citizens, the questions of data policy, data retention. We still don't have a data protection law in India, but we're expecting that the select committee that was working on it will come up with a report shortly, and maybe even in the monsoon session of Parliament we might get a chance to adopt that, but that will then have implications for this. There are questions of the safety of end-to-end encryption. For example, with the government telling companies that encrypt their messaging, that they will have to keep some sort of key so that if a message is found to be violative of law, that the government by law can ask who originated that message in India, who was the first sender of that particular message in India, etc. So you've got all of these issues that need to be sorted out, and I have to admit that I don't believe there will be unanimity in the committee, which is after all a committee made up of politically elected MPs, and there's bound to be political preferences being reflected in some of the stands that MPs will take. We may end up coming up with a report that will say on the one hand this, on the other hand that. But once the report is done, I'm very happy to come back for another chat and give you my own views. But right now I have to maintain the discretion required of a committee chair in our parliamentary system.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
There's a question that has come on the website. Dr. Tharoor, who is a careerist politician? And do you think more people will be taking up careers in politics given the responses in their respective countries by their respective governments?
No, a political career is one thing, but a political careerism is another. A careerist is somebody who is interested in politics only as a means of his or her self-advancement, whether it's making more money, getting more position, getting more power, getting more benefits for themselves. That's what a careerist is. And a careerist is not encumbered by considerations of policy, ideology, principle. They'll take one stand today, but if their careerism prompts them to switch parties tomorrow, they'll take the opposite stand. I mean, I've had people making the most eloquent speeches in defense of secularism and then joining the BJP and making the opposite speeches shortly thereafter. And these are the elements that go into careerism as a political practice. I believe that politics is really one of those professions where values, ideas, and ideals matter terribly. I may not agree with your ideals, but as long as you have those ideals and you profess them in your politics, I respect you as being in politics to pursue your vision of a just society, a good society, a perfect society, just as I have my vision of the kind of society. And so I would, for example, believe that my vision of what's good for India is of an inclusive society, an inclusive India where people of every caste, creed, religion, language, color, region all have equal stakes, equal rights, and feel an equal ownership of Indian democracy. Whereas others, in their own ways and for their own logic, see an India which should be principally a Hindu Rashtra, should be a state of, for, and by the Hindu majority, and don't accept my premise that the state should be even-handed in dealing with all its citizens equally. Well, I think the two sets of ideas are so completely incompatible with each other that it boggles my mind to imagine that somebody who worked in a party that advocated one of those ideas found it possible to switch to the party that advocated the other set of ideas and could hold them both without any sort of dissonance in their own head. But there are people who do that, and they're the ones I call the careerists, because all they care about is, will I get a ministership out of this, or a ticket out of this, or an opportunity to get position or power or money or whatever else it may be. And that's why, unfortunately, we have seen a number of politicians moving away from professions of principle and ideology into what's in it for them rather than what's in it for the country.
We had Marilyn who had a question as well.
Good evening, sir. So my question is, ever since United States initiated a trade war with China, they were able to reduce its dependency on China in a very massive way, do you think India is in a position to reduce or initiate a trade war with China? Or when do you think India will be in a position to initiate a trade war with China? Because right now we are suffering a huge trade imbalance. So I would like to know your views on that.
Yeah, I mean, there are others who are greater experts on this, but I can tell you from what I have seen that I don't really see much chance of India being able to reduce its trade dependence on China, not just because China was the only major economy that grew significantly in 2020 and therefore is even more a source of, but because it's an extremely essential source of supplies to us as a country in terms of everything from goods that are cheaper than we can make ourselves, to the elements that go into making goods, machines to make products, ingredients for pharmaceuticals, chemical ingredients, all of these things that come from China make us more dependent on them rather than less. And so I'm disinclined to suggest or consult or recommend anything like a trade war. And the other thing we have to understand is, however big China is for us in India as an economic partner, and it is in terms of goods our biggest economic partner, the US only becomes number one when you add goods and services together. But however big China is for us, we are not big for China. We account for barely 2% of China's exports. So even if we declare a trade war and shut down all exports from China, that's just 2%. They're growing by 8. So how does 2% bother them? That's why I don't think this talk of a trade war with China actually makes any sense at all. We'll end up hurting ourselves more than gaining from it. I'm not terribly fond of the Chinese, and I'm very conscious that we're talking on the 14th of June, which is actually the very day and night on which 20 of our soldiers lost their lives at Chinese hands in Galwan a year ago, June 14, 15. So I'm very conscious of the pain that bears, and I would love to be able to cut my dependence on a country that did that to my fellow citizens. But at the same time, I don't see how realistically we can do that. And so I think I have to accept that in not overreacting as some would see it, our government probably felt it had no choice.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. Arpita?
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Tharoor. It was a very
Hi.
insightful session. But my question
Thank you.
is, I did understand that there is the problem of access to tech when it comes to the digital divide. A lot of students have to face the brunt of this entire shift to internet and online examinations and online classes. However, at the same time, the parliament not being allowed their democratic duties, like you said, not being able to take any course of action with regards to this entire problem of digital divide. What do you think is the way forward right now for the current government and for everybody who's in power to make a change with regards to the same?
Actually, on the digital divide, the government doesn't need the parliament to approve it because there's no law that needs to be passed. It's just implementation. The government can give guidance to universities and schools and policies. It can redouble its efforts to introduce broadband connectivity with significant speed. It can release more spectrum for the purpose so that greater speeds are possible and available. It can improve more reliable electricity distribution so that we don't have power cuts everywhere all the time, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's about executive actions that the government can do with greater efficiency, reliability, et cetera, and resources where necessary. And then you can deal with the digital divide. And of course, if, for example, some enlightened state governments are able to provide every single student in their high school system, as I think Tamil Nadu does, with either a laptop or a tablet, then of course that's great. And then of course they'll also need to be able to have a data pack to access data. But I mean, those are ways in which governments can actually help overcome the digital divide right there and then. You don't, in practice, need to do this through parliament or through parliamentary laws. And no one is going to say we like the digital divide. Everyone wants to see it overcome. So government can do this as a matter of policy.
Great. We're going to begin to wrap up. Utkarsh, last question, and then Vedika and I will close the session.
Thank you, Utkarsh. Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. This has been great. My question too is, a whole generation is looking up to, in India is looking up at the new decade with access to a plethora of new tools like the one we are on right now. At the same
Yeah.
time, we also have news about, say, somebody's content being asked to be removed. The government makes a request. How do we put these two together, and what do you think the political class can do to come together and provide a ray of hope to this new generation who is seeking or expecting much more from the political class?
Look, Akash, I wish I could tell you the political class is united on this. It's not. I come down very firmly on the side of greater freedom of speech, greater freedom of expression, greater opportunities for individuals to express themselves. My yardstick is very clear. Until they actually incite violence or hatred or anything against the law, from pedophilia to communal rioting, as long as they don't do that, they should be free to say what they like, criticize who they like, abuse, satirize, do whatever they want in the space out there. Frankly, there's so much out there that in any case, you really have to take an enormous amount of trouble to be offended, because there are millions of things out there that could potentially offend you or someone else. So just learn to take it in stride and ignore it. Water off the duck's back is my attitude. But I can assure you that I'm not at all confident that the majority of parliamentarians in my parliament would share that attitude. Very many. I mean, I've sat in the committee and witnessed MPs sort of frothing with indignation about the decision by Twitter to cancel President Trump's account, saying, how dare they, who gives them the right to do that, will they do it to Mr. Modi tomorrow, etc., etc. So there are different attitudes in the political class, and it's difficult in any democracy to ask for unanimity of opinion on anything. I'd like to think that we would have a unanimity on ground rules that really emerge from the liberal constitutionalism embedded in the founding of our republic. But even that's up for grabs, and not everyone shares. In fact, if you have read my recent book, The Battle of Belonging, those of you in England and the UK will only see it later this year under the title, The Struggle for India's Soul. I've actually argued about this entire thing, or whether liberal constitutionalism is the core underpinning of Indian nationalism, or whether that nationalism is being rewritten, reinvented by those who are now in power in India today. And I certainly see a lot of signs of that kind of reinvention in ways that, to my mind, are at odds with what I thought our constitution was all about. So all I can say is, don't expect unity from the political class, but hope that there will always be political voices speaking out for your side of every issue. And your next door neighbor may have a different side of the issue, and that person also deserves having a political representative speaking out for that person's side of the issue. That's what democracy, democratic contestation should be all about. At the end of the day, whoever wins the votes gets to implement their vision. And that's really the best we can hope for as we navigate our way through these rather perilous shoals and rocks that we've talked about for the last hour.
Great. Vedika?
I actually had a couple of questions to wrap up on, Dr. Tharoor. One was from someone in the audience who is no longer there, but I thought it was a really interesting question, and kind of very topical. He mentioned that since you were talking about democratizing tech, democratizing finance, um, wanted to bring up the issue of blockchain and decentralization, which is, a very big subject of interest within the tech community in India in particular. And I follow startup news quite closely, and one of the more interesting things we've seen is a lot of Indian tech entrepreneurs kind of working on things like definance, cryptocurrencies, not in urban centers, but in coming up in places you really wouldn't expect. So it's a really interesting trend to keep an eye on. And he wanted to ask you, this is Rahul, he wanted to ask you, why is it that the Congress doesn't talk about stuff like this? Why is it that the Congress perhaps doesn't engage with some of these cutting edge themes in technology? And I was curious about that.
Well, this congressman does, I can assure you. Ask him to Google my article in the Indian Express from just last week about this very issue of blockchain and cryptocurrency. And one of my observations is the problem in India is we tend to ban what we don't understand. And it's high time we actually took the trouble to understand these things and see whether we can have enlightened policy making rather than a reflexive regulatory approach that says, no, no, we won't allow this, which is what had happened. The Reserve Bank had actually disallowed cryptocurrency in India. Now the Supreme Court has reopened the issue because of precisely the awareness of the advantages of blockchain. So some people are saying blockchain, yes, cryptocurrency, no, but I'm not sure how many people understand how all these things add up. So as far as the Congress Party is concerned, as far as I'm concerned, these are issues we do think about, we have thought about, and I've even written about. And I'd like to say that I believe that people in the Congress Party are very open in terms of policy making and regulation. Cynics will say, well, it's easy for you to be open because you're in opposition and you have no responsibility for dealing with the consequences of any of these policies you advocate. Perhaps, but at the same time, since we still cherish the belief that we'll be back in power one day, we don't really want to advocate policies that will bite us in the leg when we come to power. So we certainly want policies that we want to advocate policies that are for the good of the entire nation, whoever is in power. And that's why I feel that we can't afford to be left behind as blockchain moves on at this part of the 21st century.
Thanks, Dr. Tharoor. I also know you have a meeting, so we'll wrap up. Wanted to end on a note, really referring back to your book, The Elephant, Tiger, and the Cell Phone. You have been an observer of India for such a long time. I wanted to ask you, when you look at India now from the lens of technology, you know, what is the larger picture that you see? How much has changed in your own lifetime? And wanted to end on a bit of a more optimistic note. Like, you know, it would be great to get your takeaway on just the changes you've seen, and you know how things have changed in India when it comes to technology, just in your lifetime.
Hugely and unrecognizably, and I'd be unashamedly willing to recommend your husband's book, Midnight's Machines by Arun Mohan Sukumar, which actually talks about the challenges facing technological policy making since independence and how much things have changed. I grew up in an India where literally in a city like Mumbai, there was no television, where Mumbai and Calcutta, where I went to high school, where there was only TV available in Delhi, that too one single black and white channel that mainly showed agricultural programs, and the only entertainment that offered the middle class was Chitrahar or extracts of Hindi movie songs. That was about it. Really, there was no television. There was the perception that anything involving electronics was a luxury that a poor country couldn't afford. Even color TV only came in the 1980s, when it was around in our neighboring countries for a couple of decades already. There was obviously no Nintendo, no PlayStation, no personal computers, no mobile phones, no handhelds, nothing. And the embrace of technology that came post Rajiv Gandhi, and I will give him credit for that, that showed such astonishing changes that I did chronicle in The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone, because, you know, I left an India where for a then population of 600 million people, there were only 2 million telephones in the entire country, where there were 8-year-long waiting lists for people to get a phone. And when you got a phone, you often didn't get a connection, or you got the connection, you often got a wrong number when you dialed one. It was just absolutely not a priority for the government to even have communications technology function effectively. And you fast forward today, when India was selling by 2005 or 6 more mobile telephones than any other country in the world, and growing faster than any market in the world. That was an astonishing emblem of the transformation caused by technology. Similarly, Y2K and the software revolution in India, the fact that suddenly we all became computer programmers, saving the world from the imminent collapse of the entire global computing system when the clock struck 2000. You remember that little drama. Some say it was a conspiracy dreamt up by some smart Indian to sell Indian software. But we started writing code to prevent computers crashing, and established a computer software and programming and code writing reputation that has made India a major force in that side of technology. Today, of course, some of that is considered technological coolie labor, to put it cruelly, but it's something that we've done better, more extensively, and longer than anyone else. So the way in which the India of fakirs lying on beds of nails and snake charmers, uncoiling snakes from their basket, gave way in the international global imagination to an India of computer geeks and software wizards, is itself proof of the dramatic ways in which technology has changed what being Indian has been perceived to be all about around the world. And I think we should build on that. I think we are in danger right now of being left behind in some of the cutting edge changes we talked about, particularly AI, machine learning, and so on, where India has not been perceived to have kept up with the kind of stuff that even Indians in places like Silicon Valley are doing to change the world. And certainly countries like China have gone way ahead of us in terms of the new cutting edge technologies of the third decade of the 21st century. So we have a long way to go, but the changes have been transformative, and we need to get back that spirit of adventure we had in the 1990s to embrace all these possibilities and stay out in front. I genuinely believe we have the brain power to do it. Perhaps what we need is enlightened policy making that will free up more Indian innovation, educational policy making that will encourage more out of the box thinking, entrepreneurial and tax systems that will encourage more people starting risky ventures in high tech. And we may well get out there while at the same time overcoming the digital divide that we can't afford to overlook. So that's my quick summary of where I think we should go. I really do need to wrap up now, but it's been a wonderful conversation from both of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. This was truly special for us. We covered a wide range of subjects, and I think you've given us a lot to think about, from lightning calls from your generation to becoming an AI mini superpower. This conversation has given us lots to reflect on. Thank you for your time. Thank you all for joining in such large numbers. This will be available as a podcast on all platforms within an hour or two. So we'll share the link. For more interesting programs, do check out networkcapital.tv. Thank you again, Dr. Tharoor. See you, Vedica. See you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. All the
Bye.
best. Bye.